Everyone's doing well this morning. And you could tell my backdrop is different than normal. We had a few different things occur last second with our internet, so we're like, we should probably zip over here so we can actually use Zoom. So anyway, glad you guys are all welcome here this morning and able to join us. Now, if you guys wouldn't mind, let's just go ahead and flip over to Romans 3. That's where we're going to be in the text this morning. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now, by the way. Let me do that. There we go. So we're going to be in Romans 3. And I know, most of us are pretty much very familiar with this chapter. And maybe for those of you who aren't, or maybe are a little less familiar, I'm sure to some capacity you've either heard or seen verse 23 from this chapter quoted. It says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." I know, that's at least been heard somewhere to people who aren't as familiar with this whole chapter. As I began prepping and reading for this sermon today, I was struck by something that I found very, very peculiar. And I'm sure you guys have considered it. It never really dawned on me. It never even really clicked until I came up to a specific thing that I was reading in my study this week. But have you guys ever considered just how closely the words righteousness and justice play hand in hand together under the biblical umbrella? Have you guys ever considered that? It's kind of neat to think about. I'm sure maybe most of you have run across that realization at some point, but I don't know why it just never clicked on me. You see, in its biblical definition, righteousness means the condition acceptable by God. The condition acceptable by God. And in a narrower biblical sense, it relates to justice. I think it's important to set up the stage this way because we examine, let me put it this way. As we're going to be going into what we're studying today, you're going to see and study a little more with the rest of us, the righteousness of God. And you're going to see that at the same time, justice is going to parallel itself closely and hand in hand too. But specifically, we will see how God is always just in his every action. So I always like to start with the big idea. If you guys haven't noticed by now, the big idea we've got for today is that the righteousness which God gave us is to remind us that God is both just and the justifier. That's a mouthful. It's a mouthful. So, it's there on the screen, but let me just say that again. The righteousness which God gave to Christians is to remind Christians that God is both just and the justifier. And we'll see a little more what that actually means. Hopefully you guys are now by this point opened up to Romans 3. There's a lot of ground to just cover here as far as reading goes. So just bear with me. I'm going to read a little faster on purpose so that we can get to the meat and bones of today's message. But starting here in verse 1, if you guys would join with me, you can follow along. Then what advantage has the Jew? Or what is the value of circumcision? Much in every way. To begin with, the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. What if some were unfaithful? Does their faithlessness nullify the faithfulness of God? By no means. Let God be true, though everyone were a liar, as it is written, that you may be justified in your words and prevail when you are judged. But if our unrighteousness serves to show the righteousness of God, what shall we say? That God is unrighteous to inflict wrath on us? I speak in a human way. By no means. For then how could God judge the world? But if through my lie, God's truth abounds to his glory, why am I still being condemned as a sinner? And why not do evil that good may come? As some people slanderously charge us with saying. Their condemnation is just. What then? Are we Jews any better off? No, not at all. For we have already charged that both Jews and Greeks are under sin. As it is written, no one is righteous, no, not one. No one understands, no one seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they have become worthless. No one does good, not even one. Their throat is an open grave. They use their tongues to deceive. Their venom of asps is under their lips. Their mouth is full of curses and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood, and in their paths are ruin and misery. And the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be stopped, and the whole world will be held accountable to God. For by the works of the law, no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin. But now the righteousness of God, which has been manifested apart from the law, although the law and prophets bear witness to it, the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. For there's no distinction. For all, here it is, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and are justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a propitiation for by his blood to be received by faith. This was to show God's righteousness, because in his divine forbearance, he had passed over former sins. It was to show his righteousness at the present time, so that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. Then what becomes of our boasting? It is excluded. By what kind of law? By a law of works? No, but by a law of faith. For we hold that one is justified by faith apart from works of the law. Or is God the God of Jews only? Is he not also the God of Gentiles? Yes, of Gentiles also, since God is one, who will justify the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through faith. Do we then overthrow the law by faith, by this faith? By no means. On the contrary, we uphold the law. That's chapter 3. Paul spent time in the previous chapter clarifying that circumcision based on Old Testament law was not meant to be a mark of like spiritual maturity or spiritual purity from just an outward appearance. That's not what it was meant for. Instead, it was a symbol of what should be reflected in the heart of a regenerated person. And as Paul chiseled away piece by piece at making this point, he brings us to where we are today here in chapter 3. And it's here that Paul actually reminds us of a truth. He actually reiterates this truth. And here it is. It's that it does not matter what your nationality or your ethnicity or your social and cultural upbringings or even your upbringing of spiritual guidance is. None of that matters. That has nothing to do with anything. The idea is that no affiliation to any aspect of your individual identity can be a proxy for righteousness. That's a mouthful. Basically to say that let me just repeat that actually, okay? No affiliation to any aspect of your individual identity can be a proxy or a substitute for righteousness. The Jews were God's chosen people. They were Jews by birth. They were raised with God's Old Testament law and statutes, and they even had religious leaders who ruled the entire nation under those exact same laws and statutes. And still, the truth remains that a transformed heart does not come from these things at all, but our faith in Jesus alone. So opening up here, we're going to look at the first 8 verses right off the bat. And I think the application point we're supposed to be examining here is that we, Christians, should prevail with our prevailing king. This is kind of like an exhortation or an encouragement. We should prevail or want to prevail with our prevailing king. And in this section, here's what we see in verses 1 and 2. It's that the revelation of truth does not equate to salvation of a soul. The revelation of truth does not equate to being saved. Let me put it this way. This is another way to think about it. If someone came to evangelize to you and you were not a believer, that process of evangelism, that little encounter of evangelism, does not declare your innocence and redemption. Make sense? Now, in an even further delineation of this, the Jews that Paul is speaking of here in this chapter, they were given way more than a basic introductory gospel message or an evangelism encounter. Remember how we just mentioned that they were God's chosen people, God's chosen nation? The nation who was supposed to be the closest to God in basically every aspect of life. The nation that was supposed to be the closest to God actually ended up living as though they were the farthest from God. They lost the purpose and intent that God had given to them through his laws. They totally lost that idea and understanding. See, what they first knew of God and his heart behind the implementation of these laws now just became a ritualistic practice that they started believing, well, me doing this maintains my purity. That's verses 1 and 2. But coming up right here after that, I think is where the beauty and the hope of this section of this chapter lies. And here's what verses 3 through 8 teach us: that God's perfect character is 100% independent of your response to him. 100% independent of your response to him. That is to say, what you do does not make God act faithlessly or sinfully toward you at all. He always carries out everything perfectly. See, we're human, so we think in human terms. If someone was to come up to me and do some sort of wrong or commit some sort of sin against me, my natural inclination is to respond or retaliate or get vengeance or to get even. None of those are right, pure heart motives. And humans think that way. That's just our instinct. We kick into that without even thinking about it. God never acts towards unrighteousness from a position of unrighteousness. He always acts perfectly. And I think that it's when we look at these verses, it shows God will prevail in his judgment of all unrighteousness. That quoting right there from the Old Testament, that just shows that. It's right off the bat right there. It's so clear to see. God will prevail in his judgment of all unrighteousness. In 2018, an 18-year-old woman by the name Niall Wilson was fatally stabbed and killed at a BART platform in Alameda. You guys have maybe even seen that come up in the news back then, or maybe even recently. The alleged killer, named John Lee Cowell, had no apparent motive for this action that anyone can identify even to this day. This was 2 years ago, 2018. In 2020, the trial went underway for Cowell's allegations against him, with his defense attorney making the claim before the trial even began, saying, hey, John Lee Cowell should be treated as one who is insane. Okay, that was supposed to be the underlying belief. Their expectation was to be set that, hey, treat him as though he's insane. So just a few months ago, in March, the judge that was involved in this trial did something pretty extraordinary. I mean, you don't see it happen a lot, in my opinion, or maybe I haven't seen it happen a lot. But he did something extraordinary. See, as the jury was going into their third day of deliberation, the judge halted the whole trial, literally called it off and said, hey, I'm declaring John Lee Cowell as sane at the time of the incident against his attack against Naya. He was sane, not insane. Interesting fact, even after the trial had ended and this was the finding that he had settled on, the jury was said to have actually agreed with the judge and saying, hey, yeah, we came to an 11-1 finding that he was actually insane. Or sorry, that he was actually sane. We agree with the judge. This is a demonstration of justice. This is a demonstration of action against evil that we see here in our backyard. We consider the fact that a man who stabbed a woman to death, as we look at that and say, hey, that's not just unjust, that's heinous, that's evil, that's cruel, that's disgusting, that's wicked. Things like this stir us up so that we say, hey, we want justice for what just happened. That's not right. Someone answer to that. Now, could you imagine if this case turned out the other way around, where the judge halted the jurors' deliberation and declared Cowell as insane and said all charges must be dropped? How would that sit with you? How would it sit with you if the judge literally ended the trial and said, nope, drop all charges, he's insane, even if the jurors think otherwise? I'll be real honest with you guys. That would make me pretty infuriated. I'd be very upset about that. I mean, you want action. Someone was innocently killed. Thankfully, that's not how it turned out. But see, this is an example of something that I think we can learn a greater lesson from. This judge is simply a human judge. Just a human judge. And in almost every sense, we seem to just naturally expect justice to be served in situations just like this. John Lee Cowell, actually, was sentenced to life in prison not long ago. But this is a human judge who answered with justice. Imagine how much more God judges perfectly in all of his decrees and in how he responds to unrighteousness. God perfectly executes all that out and never misses a step. He's always in the right. See, God always answers in a timely manner. And in addition, he perfectly responds to unrighteousness in the exact fashion that needs to be addressed. Exact fashion. That's why, in my estimation, Paul makes this very same case in verses 5 through 8. And to quote this, this passage even states, our unrighteousness serves to show the unrighteousness of God. And Paul's using this in his line of arguing. I think when he's pointing this out, it's supposed to symbolize or signal two very important things for us. The first is this, that no unrighteousness in this world is going to go unanswered. Not a single one's going to be missed. Every single one's going to be answered to. But I think the second thing that this is supposed to signal to us is this, that just because your unrighteous actions serve to show God's righteousness does not mean that you can carry on in your own sins. It does not mean that at all, okay? See, that's exactly what people try to accusing Paul of over here. They try putting him into a corner with human logic and saying, oh, hey, Paul, well, see, look, if what you're saying is true, if A plus B equals C, then hey, yeah, well, who cares? I can carry on doing my own thing, and God can't blame me. I mean, after all, my unrighteousness just puts his righteousness on display even higher. It's a win-win. It's fine. Who cares? If you agree with these same accusers, and if you agree with this line of thinking, you're fooled. Flat out, I gotta say. You're fooled if you think God designed things this way. But you want to know the sad truth? Many Christians who hide their sins well are just as guilty of this as unbelievers who live it out in the open without shame. So this is something that we got to look inside of ourselves too. God is always right to combat the unrighteousness and rebellious heart. The unrighteous and rebellious heart that desires to just seek its own evil way. There's a pastor by the name Daniel Hans who had said this in one of his sermons. This was a while ago. He said, when John Belushi died in the spring of 1983 of an overdose of cocaine and heroin, a variety of articles appeared, including one in the U.S. News and World Report, on the seductive dangers of cocaine. It can do you no harm, and it can drive you insane. It can give you status in society, and it can wreck your career. It can make you the life of the party, and it can turn you into a loner. It can be an elixir for high living and a potion for death. Like all sin, there seems to be a difference between the appearance and the reality, between the momentary feeling and the lasting effect. Church, don't forget that no matter what happens in this life, God is always going to prevail in his judgments. Always. And so I guess the question that we need to consider is this. Do you want to prevail alongside him? Or do you want to be with the world and be the object of his judgment? Do you harbor any unrighteousness in your heart that you've worked hard to keep hidden? Do you fool yourself into thinking that your sin will only produce God's righteousness even better, and so it's just fine to continue on? Who cares? I'll do my thing, and that's not hurting. I pray that wouldn't be true. Remember earlier at the very beginning of this, we said that our big idea for today was that the righteousness which God gave us is to remind us that God is both just and the justifier. And so we should desire to prevail with him when he comes to be the just and the justifier. And so as we see that as a reminder, this big idea, we're actually served with another reminder in the next set of verses. And I think the application here is that we should preserve our account as clear before God. I think that's what these verses are generally just trying to make us understand, is that we should preserve our account as clear before God. Here's a hard pill to swallow. You guys ready for this? You're not good. You never were. Neither was I. Neither am I. At least not according to God's standards. Now, envision being in the shoes of a Jew and hearing Paul say this to you. I feel like one moment your gut is just going to be wrenched with a painful blow to your pride. And then the next moment you're defending yourself saying, dude, Paul, what are you talking about? I've kept all the laws of God. What are you telling me? Israel, a nation who had the oracles of God and were taught how to live a holy and righteous life by God himself. God himself taught them those things. They got it backwards and upside down. Do you really think you would have gotten it any straighter than the Jews? I don't think so. I wouldn't. I know that. The reality is this: not one of us are righteous in and of ourselves. Not a single one of us, okay? If we hold on to tradition or rely on our own goodness or play the ignorance is bliss card, we will be sorely regretful. Going to church doesn't save us. Reading the Bible doesn't save us. Praying 3 times a day doesn't save us. Living by the law doesn't save us. You want to know what all that points to? You want to know what all these things point to? Look right here in verse 20. It shows us the law and these other efforts. I got a little bit of bad editing there. The law and all these other efforts, which, by the way, were not created to be a means to an end. All these things create in us the knowledge of our own sin. They create in us the knowledge of our own sin. So doing these things does not produce righteousness. Everything that the Jews were ever told about the law was not told to them so that they can maintain their purity or their salvation. It was actually meant to show them the depths of their sin. The depths of their sin. Think about this. How many times do you think it must have taken for this realization to sink in for a man who had to go slaughter his animals year after year to atone for his own sins? Think about that. I mean, how many times does someone have to go take his own animals, put his hand on them, kill them, watch the life drain out of them because of his own sins? Do you think it would have taken 1 time? 10 times? 1,000 times? How many times does that take to sink in for us, for you and me? The reality is that the law, like I mentioned earlier, had an intent behind it, and the Jews lost sight of it over time. And if we backtrack from verse 20, just to the phrase before in verse 19b, it says that we are held accountable to God. The world, which is including us, is held accountable to God. And so how do we preserve our account as clear? If we want to be clear before God, if our account should be clear before God, how do we preserve it? There's a lot of things to say, but here's some probing questions. Do you rely on your own efforts? Do you rely on religious practices? Do you rely on ritualistic Christian attitudes and Christian lifestyle living? Or do you rely solely on the gift of salvation through Jesus? Do you go to him in faith that he has cleared your guilt once and for all? Is Jesus the Lord, the master of your life? Is Jesus the Lord of your life? If so, do you submit to him in all things? Again, just to touch back from what we said earlier, the big idea for today's message is that the righteousness which God gave to Christians is to remind Christians, to remind us that God is both just and the justifier. And when we think about that, I could easily see how some people would say, well, that kind of seems to imply that we should be walking on eggshells. And I just say it's quite the contrary. It really is. It's not like that at all. See, for Christians, we should want God's role as a justifier to continually show us our never-ending need of his grace. It continues to reveal different areas of your sinful heart that you just need to keep giving back up to him and say, God, thank you for forgiving me. I want to grow out of this. We should want that. And for others, not going to lie, to see God as just can be very scary. And overall, it should just mostly serve to be a sobering thought. How do we preserve our account as clear? See, God's righteousness serves to draw the world to him, and that includes us. It really does. And in the final section of this chapter, as we wrap up, we're going to look at the fact that the application point is that we should prop up the law of faith. We should prop up the law of faith. And see, in verse 27, Paul tells us, boast in the law of faith. Boast in the law of faith. The idea is that instead of relying on our own works and abilities to uphold a list of do's and don'ts, we're supposed to rely on the faith by which salvation was given to us. This is the same faith that in verses, right there, I think I maybe missed a step, but there, the faith which we inherit for us as the righteousness of Christ, in verses 22 through 25 tell us that. It shows that the same faith that we have, it inherits for us the righteousness which comes from Christ. Christ imputes that to us. That's now on our account. Funny enough, this section of the chapter I had actually planned to spend the least amount of time on, but it's also where I drew the title to today's sermon, Justified by Grace. I don't know. I mean, I felt like these verses are probably the most familiar to us out of the whole chapter. But though they are familiar, it doesn't necessarily mean that we should that they should lose their effects on our hearts. They're still equally important, and we have only so much time to work with. So let's examine the final verses by way of a single question. Why did God set it up for us to be justified by grace? Think about that. Why? Why did God set it up so that we could be justified by grace? I actually think that the answer is in verse 25b through 26. I think it's because God wanted to show his righteousness to us, because he had again to prove his patience to us. Because even though we fail again and again and again, his patience outlasts our furthest sins. Because God desired to be both just and the justifier for those who put their faith in his Son. I think that's why he set it up so that we could be justified by grace. I think it's because of this. Paul delighted and said, hey, church, boast in the law of faith. Boast in the law of faith. Man, I would be hyped up the same way Paul would be if I took a more honest approach to intentionally see God's hand in my daily life. Honestly, I really would be equally hyped. And I'm actually ashamed to say that I don't do that as well as I want to. I want to get better at that. I want to be able to boast in the law of faith like it's a first knee-jerk instinct reaction. And so for me, this just serves as a really humbling point and also a great reminder to boast in the law of faith. God's given us so much reason to boast in him as his children. He really has. See, this is the same God who, according to verse 30, will justify the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through faith. The true believer is justified by faith, or whoever says that they're a believer will be justified by faith, and others are turned to him through faith. Such a beautiful observation. This, you guys, is an impartial God, an impartial judge who carries out justice well, who serves righteousness to respond to unrighteousness. And so lastly, just to close up here, we've got some parting exhortations to re-examine. It's that the first is what we discussed, to prevail with our prevailing King. To choose to walk in a manner worthy of your calling as a child of God. Don't choose to be the object of his judgment. You don't want to be there. Be alongside him. Be alongside God, desiring to walk in the righteousness he's granted you. That was the first thing that we looked at. And the second thing, just by looking at this list, is that we should be preserving our account as clear. Preserving our account is clear. So, hey, maybe that means don't store up any imbalance in your account. Rely on the righteousness of Christ as your eternal standing before the Father. Don't be fooled into thinking you can offer up anything else as an equal substitute for the cost which Christ paid for you. It doesn't exist. No substitute. And last, we just saw that we should be boasting in the law of faith, propping up the law of faith. Church, boast in your God. Boast in him. He's so cool. Seriously. The faith which you've placed in him is what you're supposed to live by. Don't live by your works. Don't live by your customs. Don't live by your moral code book. Don't live by anything short of the blood of Jesus, which was shed for you to have eternal life. I think the sooner that you get a grip on this and the sooner that I get a grip on this, the sooner we will all see just how vast our need for the Lord is. That's Romans 3 in a nutshell. Because we didn't have as much time to go through the last section, I'd encourage you just to go and have some fun study on your own. Thank you.